the legislative meeting. This is being recorded and will be available for a while anyway for everyone to see. Tonight, Dr. Yanni is going to give us a presentation on some of the legislative priorities for the professional associations and some of the ideas that are circulating in Harrisburg. And then what I would ask, and I think what the community is most interested in, is to share your advice and perspectives on how interested members of the community can be most effective in advocating and lobbying for some needed change that's particularly relevant to our district.
Great, thank you. We'll just remind everyone, if everyone can put their computers on mute so that we don't interfere with the sound, that would be great. And can you see my screen?
Looks good.
All right, so thank you for that welcome, Dr. Ridke. Tonight, I want to talk about some of the legislative priorities that have come forth from Pennsylvania School Boards Association, which is obviously the association that advocates on behalf of all school boards. And I'll change that, the second one, it should say PASA, not PSBA. The Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators, which is our superintendent group. And then we'll talk about some of the advocacy work that we've done as a district. And then I'll make some recommendations about some of the things that we should think about as we go into next year. And one of the things that I think will come through tonight is, for the first time in a long time, we're seeing the fruits of the labor of some of this advocacy actually come through. So I want to start with some coherence building. So when we think about advocacy, individual districts have almost no advocacy influence, right? Even when groups of districts work together, there's really little advocacy influence. What really needs to happen is you have to get one of the P groups involved. So PASA, which is the superintendent's organization, PSBA, which is the school boards association. There's also PASBO, which is the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials. That's really where you get, once you engage with the P groups and a number of districts, that's where you can actually get some advocacy to really move the needle on things. Groups of districts and more than one P group has potentially significant advocacy influence. And so if you look at that diagram there, it's where you see that star in the middle. It's when you have all of these groups working together. So you have the district working with PASA and working with PSBA. And as we go through the presentation tonight, I'm going to share some of the outcomes of some of that work. It's also really important to note that when we think about advocacy, it really takes continuous dialogue with elected officials. So in a little bit, we'll talk about the PSBA Advocacy Day that Ms. Thomas, Ms. Schaffmeister, and I had the opportunity to attend. But beyond that, we're talking to our local elected leaders all the time, because ultimately we want them, when they're faced with questions about education, to pick up the phone and call the superintendent so that we can give them answers and our voices can really be reflected in Harrisburg. So continuous dialogue with elected officials, time and patience. So a lot of the advocacy work that we've been engaged in takes years to come to fruition. So we'll start briefly with PSBA. So Ms. Thomas, would you give the group an overview of Advocacy Day?
Sure. So myself, Ms. Schaffmeister, and Dr. Yanni attended PSBA's Advocacy Day in Harrisburg about 2 weeks ago or so, 3 weeks. We got to meet with Representative Mary Jo Daley and Tim Briggs, and also Senator Capoletti. Some of our meetings were just our group, just the three of us with them. And then some of our meetings, we were with other local school districts as well, who are represented by some of those representatives. So the main focus for our Advocacy Day was on cyber charter school funding reform. And there's a big push right now for districts to pay a flat fee per student for students that are attending cyber charter schools. Right now, there's a very large range of what school districts are paying per student, depending on what cyber charter school the student is attending. And the range is anywhere from, Dr. Yanni probably has the numbers, but I want to say it's like between 10 and 40,000 about. So, you know, a wide variety of prices within that. So the ask and the push to the legislature is a flat fee of about $8,000 per student, which is plenty of money per pupil to allow the cyber charter schools to still run, to pay their staff, to operate. But it would realize lots of savings back to the districts that are currently paying between $10,000 and $40,000 per pupil to these schools. These schools are cyber schools, so they don't have, you know, a brick and mortar building. There's no maintenance, there's no upkeep of the buildings, but yet they're getting funding as if there, you know, was all of those needs as well. So that was one of our big areas of focus. And then the other area of focus that our district is pushing for, that some of you may know about, is the current 10-mile radius requirement for busing of non-public school students, which is something that lots of districts in southeastern PA right now are struggling with retaining bus drivers in general. And this 10-mile radius for busing non-public school students really puts a drain on the ability of our transportation department to provide transportation for our own students, as well as students attending those schools within a 10-mile radius of the outermost parts of our school district. So while our school district currently has 11 schools, we transport to our 11 schools and about 120 other schools within a 10-mile radius daily. We have to follow those other schools' bell schedules. They do not follow our bell schedules. We follow when they have early dismissals, days off that don't coincide with our days off, things like that. And so the ask for that is to reduce the radius, either to a 5-mile radius or to only those non-public schools within our district boundaries. And then there's also, you know, talk and push to get the state budget approved in a timely manner. Typically, you know, the budget is supposed to be approved by June 30th. Last year it was extremely late when it was approved. The goal, I would say at this point, is for it to be approved at some point over the summer.
Great, thank you, Ms. Thomas.
Sure.
You really hit on all those points. I have a list of things that I wanted to make sure we covered, so thank you.
Yep.
So the Advocacy Day was sponsored by PSBA. So there were representatives from the School Boards Association, and there were, I would say, many districts represented this year. It was a little bit lighter in attendance than it has been in the past. Lots of districts from our region and many districts from right out in the mid-state, because right there at the Capitol, and then some districts from Allegheny County. So when you think about what the School Boards Association is advocating for, is continued state and federal financial investments for school districts. We know that it takes an incredible amount of money to make Pennsylvania public schools run, and they're always advocating on our behalf for sensible funding. Just as an aside, up until this new funding formula that's going to go in place starting next year, we were the 46th in terms of transparency in the nation, in terms of clarity around how our funding worked. Only Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, and only those three districts had less transparency around how their state dollars were distributed to schools. Mental health and safety of students, and we'll talk about a little bit there. That's been one of our advocacy points as well. Meaningful charter reform, and you're gonna hear me say something tonight several times. When we talk about cyber charter funding reform, we're specifically talking about the funding formula. We are not at all against parents making the choice to put their children in cyber schools, but the funding formula was written in 1996 and it's never been updated. And then oppose efforts to direct financial aid to students that would typically come to one of the public schools in Pennsylvania, to have that siphoned off to in a voucher for a non-public, a private or parochial school. So those are the big priorities from PSBA. And as you can imagine, the last bullet, vouchers, is a perennial issue that we're always going to have to keep advocating for, because vouchers seem to come up every year or every other year. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to keep our eye on a lot. The Pennsylvania School Administrators, that's the organization for superintendents. So again, necessary funding. We know that the state's funding formula was declared unconstitutional. And so Governor Shapiro's budget proposal for next year is the first step at funding those districts that have been historically underfunded at levels that they've really never seen before. Now it's all one pot of money. So as some of those districts that have been underfunded for so long, that means districts like Lower Merion that have relative wealth, we're not going to get as much of an increase in state funding, which means the burden on our taxpayer is a little bit more than in some of the other districts. Again, we're advocating for health, safety, and general welfare of students and staff. High quality preparation and professional development for school leaders. You've heard a lot about the teacher shortage. And one of the things that we've spoken about at our countywide meetings is, in southeastern Pennsylvania, what we're more concerned about right now is an administrative shortage. We're still able to attract a good number of high quality teaching candidates. We're seeing fewer and fewer people that want to make the transition from a staff member to an administrator. And so that could be for any number of reasons. Salary schedules are really strong in southeastern Pennsylvania. Public education is always under attack. People aren't always as willing as they might have been before to think about going into administration. So how do we create not only a pipeline for teachers, but how do we create a pipeline for administrators? And then really working with the General Assembly to make sure that legislation that is brought forth doesn't have unintended consequences for districts. Like, for example, the vouchers. In theory, when you think about the way vouchers have been packaged in Pennsylvania, they've been called opportunity scholarships. So on the surface, the lowest 5% performing schools, students would be able to get a voucher for X number of dollars and be able to use it at another district. No one is going to argue that we want kids to be in the best environment possible. But the flip side of that is it siphons money away from already struggling schools, which just makes their problems a little bit bigger. Working to maintain effective relationships with the Department of Education, and we'll talk a little bit about standardized testing in a minute. Making sure that we have the right resources. Pennsylvania is unlike many other states. Many other states pool their education dollars together, and they actually create really robust resources for schools to be using and school systems to be using. That's not always the case in Pennsylvania. So we're really pushing on the Department of Education to really be a repository for good resources for school districts. And then really making sure that we continue, Pennsylvania, years ago was a leader in education. And over the last couple of years, or over the last decade or so, we've fallen in the rankings in Pennsylvania. So it's time for us to stop tinkering around the edges and really get after some good education reform. So those are the two P groups that we work primarily with. So what have we been doing in Lower Merion? So we've been seeking cyber charter reform for some funding reform for some time, as we mentioned before. Um, we have been seeking flexibility for state assessments. We know that the PSSAs and Keystones don't always tell a kid's real story. So we want to be able to have some flexibility there with those assessments. We want some relief in that radius for non-public transportation, the 10 miles to 5 miles, and we'll talk in a minute about what that impact is. And what we really need from the state is a set of predictable funding streams for ongoing safety and wellness supports for students. Every year that gets packaged, or the last couple of years has been packaged in grants. And grants are really tenuous because you never know from year to year if the grants are going to survive in the budget. So, as Ms. Thomas said, a bill has been introduced for a statewide tuition rate, $8,000 per student for students enrolled in the cyber charter school. So to give you some context, every student that's a Lower Merion student that goes to a cyber charter school, if they are a regular education student, we spend $22,928. That's their tuition. If the student is a special education student, that cost is actually $61,214. The average cost to educate a student for a year in a cyber charter school is somewhere between $3,500 and $4,000 a year. So if you think about Lower Merion, student leaves, the cost to educate that student is between $3,500 and $4,000 a year. We're sending over remittance for $22,928 or $61,214. The cyber charters are turning huge profits. It's why their CEOs are making multi-million dollars a year. It's why you see when you go to professional sports stadiums, you see banners and advertisements. It's why you see a lot of commercial advertisements for the cyber charters. And again, just as a reminder, we're not talking about us being against cybers, but we're against this funding formula. So a bill has been introduced to reduce that to an $8,000 per student rate for all students. Keep in mind, average is $3,500 to $4,000. The cyber charters are still turning a profit, but they're not necessarily turning the type of profit that they are now. So in some raw numbers here, I don't ever believe that what's in an introductory bill is what's going to be passed. So if we think of this being increased to $10,000 for regular education students and $12,000 a year for special education students, our savings as a district would be just over $800,000 a year. So when you think of $800,000 a year, you're talking 7 teaching positions, you're talking capital projects. You could take that $800,000 and use that in ways that are going to directly impact the students in our school. So we don't believe that bill is going to pass on its own. The good news is, though, it's probably going to be enveloped in the budget bill that will fund next year's budget. And so we're pretty confident, there's a high degree of confidence, at least right now, that could change tomorrow or next week, but that this is going to be enveloped in the budget. So this has been about 8 years in the making of advocacy. So at the beginning, when we said talk about patience and constant work with our legislators, that's 8 years of districts being really determined to make that happen. So that's a very good point. The second point there is reduction or flexibility in state testing. So last week, Governor Shapiro announced substantial changes to state assessments starting in 2026. So the assessments are going to be online. They are more closely going to mirror the instruction that kids receive on a daily basis in their classrooms, and scores will be received much more quickly than they are now. So PSSA started this week. They will end in a couple of weeks, and then it is a monumental task to administer those assessments. As Ms. Thomas knows, as a counselor, I'm sure she's on the front line of preparing all the test materials in her school. And then waiting weeks or months to get scores back. We were able to see some of the modules that the state is working on. I feel pretty confident that the new assessments are going to more closely align with what kids are doing every day in classrooms. And what it will do is it's going to save the districts or saved the state tens of millions of dollars in scoring. Right now, we have a very expensive contract with a company out in the Midwest that scores all of our assessments. And that money will be able to be returned into the state budget for allocation in other places. So there'll be more information coming probably in May. There'll be a public rollout of some sample items. So we'll be able to share that with the board and the community. PSSA and Keystone advocacy has been happening for at least a decade. For those of you that have been paying attention for a long time, when Keystones first were brought on the scene, there were going to be 10 Keystone assessments, and students were going to have to pass 6 of them to get a diploma. So right now we have Algebra 1, Biology, and English. There was supposed to be an Algebra 2, a Chemistry, a Civics, an English writing. There were going to be Keystones in world language. And quite frankly, the state ran out of money to build the assessments. So, but it is great to see that some flexibility is coming there. As Ms. Thomas said, we really are pushing for the reduced distance for required non-public transportation. If we were to be able to reduce our transportation, our radius from 10 to 5 miles, we would be able to reallocate a half dozen buses to our routes, our district routes, and probably the same number of vans or smaller buses. So this is not something that we're advocating for to make the lives of families that choose to send their kids to non-publics more difficult. And we're not looking at this as a budgetary savings, but as the workforce in terms of drivers continues to be a challenge, if we were able to repurpose a dozen vehicles for our internal routes, that would be of great benefit. The issue with this push, although Representative Daley has now committed that she's going to work with Montgomery County superintendents on this, this really impacts those of us in southeastern Pennsylvania because of the density of the population, and it affects a lot of districts out in Allegheny County. When you're in the middle of the state, because of how spaced out, you don't have that same level of density, it's not as impactful for much of Pennsylvania. And so there aren't a lot of elected officials that are willing to use their social capital or their political capital to help work on an issue that is really a southeastern and Allegheny County problem. But again, we are really delighted to see that districts are, the district should be going to be well supported by our local legislators. And then some predictable funding for safety and wellness support. So earlier I said, right now the issue is that wellness money, mental health funds, and safety are packaged as grants. When something is packaged as a grant, in the last couple of years, it's been coming out of our stimulus dollars. We know those stimulus dollars need to be spent or returned by September. So if there are not new and predictable funding streams for safety and wellness supports, what will happen is one of two things. Either there won't be money allocated in the state budget for those needs, or money will be taken from other areas of education and redistributed. When money is just reallocated in the state budget, it doesn't necessarily help districts. It doesn't help communities. It doesn't reduce the tax burden. All it does is it shifts costs around. So there are a number of opportunities for us to get safety and wellness support funding in the budget for next year. Those grants have already been submitted, and I feel confident that we'll be getting that. I don't have exact figures on what we'll be getting and what that exact impact will be. We won't know that until the budget is passed, but I am confident that our applications are strong enough that we will be able to realize some significant dollars. So then it comes to advocacy efforts for 24-25, and then I'm going to turn this over to the board or to the committee. So as we think about school year 24-25, assuming that cyber charter reform is going to happen inside the budget, and we know that state assessment reform is coming, I really see three big bullet points for Lower Merion. Number one, non-public transportation radius. That's something that our entire county is going to push on, which is great because when Montgomery County pushes, we can hopefully make some measurable change there. We need to have those predictable funding streams for safety and wellness. And then the last piece there is PlanCon funding. PlanCon funding is a pot of money that the state has had for years, although it's been zeroed out in many years over the last decade, whereby districts get reimbursed for upgrading their facilities. So at one point in Pennsylvania, if you did a building project and you spent, let's say, $50 million, you would get $5 to $8 million back in reimbursement. So it naturally reduced, or you were reimbursed, which naturally reduced the debt that you had to take out on projects. That has been, that was zeroed out for 8 years in a row. It's come back, but there's such a backlog of projects that are in the PlanCon pipeline that they're, as the money comes in, it's quickly spent. So I really think it would serve us best looking at the age and condition of our facilities and knowing the capital projects we need to do over the next 3, 5, 10 years, that we should be advocating for PlanCon funding. And then, of course, we can talk about some other things. And then some recommendations. So what I would recommend is that we would next year proactively plan at least 2 of these meetings, have them in person. We would have one in the fall semester, so somewhere in the October, November timeframe. That's a particularly good time because budget negotiations haven't started at that point. So it's a good time for us to have a captive audience with our elected officials, and then have one about this time of year because this is when the budget negotiations are actually happening. And if you can get in the ears of our local elected leaders, they can take our message back to Harrisburg. So I would recommend getting 2 of those on the calendar, and I can provide the board with some dates on that. And then in terms of advocacy and legislative updates, at each of our regular school board meetings, committee chairs or co-chairs provide an update to the community of what was discussed in their committee. Even though we won't be having one of these committee meetings every month, I do think that as we move forward, it would serve us as a board and us as a community well for there to be regular updates around advocacy, because we know we have an engaged community. We have a lot of community members that really want to help with some of these issues. And if we can keep these issues alive through these updates, I think it would serve us well to keep everybody abreast of those issues. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Garrison and Dr. Ritke to talk about and the committee about Any other ideas or advocacy efforts that you might see?
Thanks, Theo. That makes a lot of sense. And looking towards scheduling, particularly the fall meeting or the spring one too, we should try, if possible, to get some of our elected state representatives at that meeting with us, right?
Exactly, right. So when I talk about scheduling those, like right now would be a difficult time to get them here because many of them are in Harrisburg.
Right.
So I'm thinking of like an October, November, but then I'm thinking like late March or like mid to late March. Next year, spring break is really late. So if we think about second or third week in March, that would be a good time to get something on the calendar because the likelihood of our state reps and our state senator being here in their home districts is much greater than it would be, at this point of April.
Right, but we should probably reach out to their offices soon. I mean, the sooner we can schedule that.
So yeah, so I've already the reason I'm recommending those two timeframes is because those are the two timeframes that when I collaborated with their offices, that's
Great.
the greatest likelihood of when they
Perfect. Makes sense. And then I'm also thinking about this. So there's 500 school districts in Pennsylvania, right? And there's a tremendous heterogeneity in the population density, the geography, the demographic makeup. So with this busing radius thing, I mean, I think this, if I'm not wrong, I think the initial law goes back to like 1949 or something, and it's been updated since then. But 75 years ago, this may have made sense, but it's got to be revisited. But because there's such a difference in all of these factors across the state, does there have to be a statewide universal policy that's universally applied to every district? Or is there some flexibility in that okay, here's the policy for the state law with regarding busing, but it incorporates some of these other determinants like density or whatever that may make
one
that
of the things,
palatable to
one of the factors we've talked about with as a Montgomery County superintendent group is if we cannot get measurable change, do we go down the density route or do we do both 5 miles, or is there some sort of intervening factor for density, right? Because where we sit as a district, 10 miles is really, really far. And keep in mind, it's 10 miles from the outer perimeter of our district.
Hey, yeah,
so
it could be 15 miles from some families' houses.
Right.
Or more.
So I was really pleased that we had an elected official willing to take this on. In the past, they've really shied away from it. I think, if I'm right in my conjecture here, there had been so much focus on the cyber charter reform happening that in the wake of that, I think some of our elected officials are feeling really good about that. So they think they can take on some of these other monumental things, which I think is why maybe we're starting to see a little bit more willingness to work with us on the transportation piece.
No, it sounds good. I was just thinking it might be less monumental or more palatable if, some of the districts that really benefit and it's not so burdensome to have this 10-mile thing could keep it. And other districts like us, could modify that. So whatever law, is built in could accommodate that. It just might be easier. And then one other thing, I know we had discussed this earlier. I actually talked to Vic Orlando about this, but as we get in the ear of some of our legislators, the Act 1 index, apparently there's no mechanism to accommodate major changes in enrollment, right? So like, for example, for us, we added full day kindergarten, we suddenly have several hundred more children. That's 3-4% more students overnight without an increase in the tax base. And there's no mechanism in the Act 1 index to accommodate for that. But apparently there used to be, like 20 years ago or something, there was some way to, I mean, it could go the other way too. Like perhaps like, I don't know, like a whole group of private schools comes or leaves a district or something. And there's a big shift in the enrollment, but it, I don't know, maybe there's an opportunity to revisit bringing some of that back, because I'm just thinking very selfishly that would help us a lot. So
I can add that. I can add that to the list there.
So I'm probably done for the moment, but anyone else have thoughts, comments, perspectives? Please feel free to share them.
I have one thing, just something for us to keep in mind as far as a fall meeting. I know both Mary Jo Daly and Amanda Capoletti are, I believe Amanda, yeah, are up for reelection. So I don't know if it makes sense to maybe do it a little earlier in October. Thinking, closer towards election day, their schedules are probably going to get pretty busy.
That's a good point.
And I can't remember if Tim is up for reelection or not this year.
I don't think he is, but that's a good point, though. When I circle back with their offices, we'll make sure that we do it with enough time, so that they're not crazy busy with their reelection.
Okay. Tim is also.
Oh,
Thanks,
is he?
Are there any informal opportunities to meet them and kind of discuss these issues?
I think there are, between now and the time that they, or the state passes the budget, they will spend the lion's share of their time in Harrisburg. I do think once they're back, so as Ms. Thomas said, the budget got passed really, really late this year. It was December. They're thinking, I don't think there's any thought that the state will have the budget passed by June 30th. So they're thinking probably sometime in July will be the time when the budget is passed. After these folks have time to get back into their districts, really right around the time our school year starts is probably the best time to have some informal meets and greets with them before the whole process gets started up again, because it could allow them to center their frame of reference around the things that we're talking about. So if that's something the committee would like to do, I'm happy to set up a late August, early September sort of, informal meet and greet where we can tell the story of the district and talk about our specific priorities with them and help them frame their reference.
Yeah, I think that's a better approach. At least from my own experience, having the informal meet and greet and, chatting with hors d'oeuvres or something. And yeah, I think that might be a better approach. And the timing in the summer, because I've seen them out at different events in the summer. So I would suggest that we go in that direction.
Sure, we can set that up.
Terrific.
I was just going to mention, I think, Steve, or Dr. Yanni, I think the presentation is great. I would suggest, I think that one of the really important things is just getting the community involved. I think that a lot of the community members have come to us as board members and said, how can we help? What can we do to get, we run into elected officials, we can write to elected officials. So I think maybe however we can convey the information to the community, whether it be at board meetings, whether it be in newsletters or emails, maybe like our wish list. And if people believe in that, that specific cause, an opportunity for them to write to, or if there's a event that they run into an elected official, they're able to have that as part of their conversation to advocate
in the
for
process.
us.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I'm in the process of like the areas of the areas of advocacy that I think that we are going to go in the direction. I'm putting together, that's literally a 1-pager that has the different topics and 3 to 5 talking points that we can make available to every community member, so that, if, when these officials hear the same thing over and over and over again, it starts to stick, right? And so if we can arm the community with that, and then also have that outreach to the community that says, look, if you're really passionate about X, whatever X is, we would urge you to let us know. And so then as we engage with the elected officials, we can bring some of the community members in. So I think that's great. I think
Perfect. And I know that some of the other, I think all of us as board members, what we do is we've been to different civic associations. So, that also gives an opportunity to reach a greater audience. And when they're asking about things that they can get involved in, we can also use that talking points for those opportunities as well.
Yeah, and we'll actually, when that's done, we'll put it up on Making Practices public as well. So it's in a it's in a spot where people can find. I mean, we'll market it that it's there, but it'll it can live there so that we can make sure that people have access to that. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah, I'm also happy to personally, I sent letters to every single senator and state representative, Democratic and Republican, with this ask. And I'm happy to, share or, modify the version of the letter that I sent somewhat. And we can make that available if possible to the community for people to get an idea of a template to use.
And to give you a shout out on that, Ms. Thomas, one of the things that we hear sometimes from like our state reps in particular is that when people when they get 10 of the same exact letter, it doesn't mean as much, right? So I think the way you wrote your letter, I think it would be great if then we kind of create like a template, keep it 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, tell the story. Paragraph 2, paragraph 3. Because I think so many times when there's big issues going on, like a charter bill is going to be put up for a vote. Some of the P organizations will put out these, these fill in the blank type things and you send it. And I mean, I've heard from reps over the years that doesn't have the same type of influence because it feels just very, automatic. They don't. So I think to the extent possible, when we can pull at people's heartstrings, we're better at, we stand a better chance of, making our cause. And specifically that number, being able to have cost avoidance of over $800,000 for cyber charter reform. It's not like that's $800,000 that we're going to put in a bank account and not use. That's $800,000 that we can reallocate to any number of needs in the district. And when we can give those types of specifics, that's really powerful.
And that's per year, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that would be would be per year. So that would be $800,000 next year and the following year and the following year and the following year. It's huge. It's huge.
All right. I think it was a great discussion. Any other comments from board members or community? I think if not, we'll wrap it there. Or Jill, is there a question? Okay.
Lisa has had her hand up, and then I'll go after Lisa.
Okay, Lisa's muted. All right.
Yep, now I'm not muted. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for this meeting. Steve, this was great information to have. I love the idea of having multiple meetings a year. In the past, we have had an annual legislative meeting where we've brought in the legislators to talk, and the students actually kind of led that and asked questions. It would be great to kind of incorporate that into, I don't know, the plan somehow. I feel like having their voice is key, and they always kind of come up with the things that are relevant to them. I also just wanted to remind you all, the Interschool Council is here. It would be great if, when you're going to Harrisburg, we could, see if we could get someone to tag along. I don't know if having a parent advocate would be an option or something that would be of interest, but if we can get the human power, it would be, I think, just kind of a nice way to kind of bridge what we're doing with the Interschool Council and advocating for students with all of the work that you're doing. Yeah, so if there are ways that parents can help support, I know at some point we had spoken about trying to put together kind of a legislative committee, and I think there have been so many other things going on that we haven't really been able to do that, but that's something that I don't know, I'll keep at the forefront of my mind.
Okay.
And Todd, my mind went exactly where yours did in terms of the density issue regarding busing. I think that's just something that, I don't know, makes a lot more sense given Lower Merion's unique density challenge in the state. So thank you all.
Okay. Jill, please. Here you go.
And now I'm not. You'll want me to mute myself. Hi, everyone. Thank you. So a few questions and comments. I do want to piggyback on a little bit of what Lisa said in terms of communicating to parents about how to get involved, and just the whole educating them in general, because I'm sure there are a lot of parents that would be interested in supporting a lot of the advocacy work, and then again having their own passions and ideas like school-based mental health. And so if there's a way to do it in addition to like a school board committee meeting or the regular school board meeting, an ISC, just like multiple ways, I think would be helpful. And one thing in the presentation where it said the legislative priorities, one of them was prioritizing mental health and safety needs of students. And I'm wondering what the PSBA focus areas of cyber charter school reform and non-public transportation is. If that's the PSBA focus areas, what does that have to do with mental health and safety needs? I had a hard time connecting those two, and maybe there's nothing to connect. Do you know what I'm talking about, or do I need to?
No, so PSBA, one of them is prioritize mental health and safety needs of students. That's one of them.
Okay, because I thought the focus areas for Advocacy Day, I guess, was cyber charter school, non-public transportation, and state budget.
So when we were there in Harrisburg, the conversations that we had centered around the topics that Ms. Thomas talked about.
Okay, and then when does each school district have its own proposals that get sent, and then there's like the general? I don't know. I remember my sister giving me a little bit of schooling on how this all works and the assembly and.
Yeah. So what'll happen? Probably in about 2 weeks, PSBA will start really peppering our board with, here's our things for our platform. Here's the legislative priorities. Do you want to submit some ideas, some suggestions? And we'll collect those from the board. The same thing with our professional organization. Around the middle of May, there'll be a meeting called Board of Governors, and we'll go to Harrisburg and we'll hash out what we want our big 3 or big 5 priorities to be for next year. So that'll be happening in the next couple of weeks.
So is that something that you think would be an opportunity to, well ahead of time, kind of inform and educate parents about, so they can have, can parents have any input in that? What our proposals are that we want to submit, or is it strictly like what the board decides?
No, I think we can have some propose or have some input into it. I think one of the things with PSBA, if I'm being completely candid, I've never really, like, they'll put out a platform. I've never seen them really change their platform from what they've done, right? So that's why I think we have to do our own advocacy on top of it.
Right. And I think maybe even, I don't know what other districts do, but maybe districts in general don't do enough of engaging the parent community. And I don't know, I'm just saying, so I don't know if that would have any more impact on PSBA changing their,
well, I think, I mean, PSBA, like, respectfully to them, they're a company, right? So they're not, I mean, they're there to speak on behalf of the school boards, but I don't know that they're trying to represent all 500 districts. So they stay very sort of 30,000 feet, where if we become better at our advocacy, and then we pair up with other districts in Montgomery County and Chester County, Bucks County, and Delaware County, and then we attach ourselves to one of the P groups, like my organization, PASA, that's when I think we can have the most measurable impact.
Okay. And you mentioned something about the grants that we applied for, and you think we will likely get them in terms of mental health and wellness. Do you have ideas of what we would use those dollars for?
It depends upon what they're approved for, like what
Okay.
we're ultimately approved for. So we wrote them for school-based mental health services.
Mhm.
So if we get approved for that, there'll be some sort of school-based mental health.
So could that be anything from a position, like a staffing position, to programming, to
It could be, yeah, it could be
consulting?
anything. If it's a staff position, it will most likely be a contracted position, just because we don't know, how long
Mhm.
the funds are available for.
Okay. I'll just cut myself off now. You know I could keep going, so I'll mute.
So I think to summarize what I heard here tonight, just to make sure that I have my notes here, we want to make sure that we do at least 2 meetings next year. Make sure we do one before the election cycle. We also want to do a meet and greet, a more informal type of opportunity to chat with our local elected officials. We want to, or we will be putting together some talking points around the big key advocacy points. We'll make those available on Making Practices Public, and also make sure that that information gets out to the community multiple times in multiple ways. Adding some legislative updates to our board meetings. That's another thing. And next year, as we think about these meetings, involving our students. And in addition to involving our students in a meeting like this, there are also going to be opportunities. The MCIU is actually starting, so that's a Montgomery County Intermediate Unit. They're actually starting a group where they're asking all districts to send student representatives to learn how to advocate at the state level for things. So I anticipate that we'll be seeking volunteers for that early next year, because they would like to start that work as early as September. Let's see. And also making sure that we educate parents in the community so that they know what our advocacy priorities are, but also if they have a passion area, they know who to contact and how to contact them and get those conversations started. So I'm not sure if I missed anything in my notes there or not.
Not in your notes, but I do have a comment.
Okay.
About that $800,000 a year the school district could save from the charter schools. I think a good way to get the rest of the community involved is saying $800,000 a year could go a long way to not having the school district raise taxes at a maximum each year. And I think that since there's more people in Lower Merion that don't have kids in the school district than do have kids in the school district, I think you're missing a valuable opportunity for advocacy by not including them as much. And I know I did hear you say and community, but it's always the focus is always on the parents. And I think that I have a group that's community. It's 2 of us, but we send out the newsletter every week and we put in, like what's hot in the area in Lower Merion and Narberth. And I think if I get some of those talking points like Sarah had, I can put that in my newsletter. That goes out to almost 500 people every week.
I think that's a great idea. Would you be open to a conversation over the phone? Because I think maybe we could collaborate on some
Sure.
things.
Always. I'm also vice president of NAACP mainline branch. So there's a lot of, and I'm with the League of Women Voters, so there's a lot of stuff that I do. And if you want to get some students involved, having that opening in the league, whether it's just elections, and the league has advocacy days. So it might be something that you might want to consider partnering with the League of Women Voters there. And I can get you, Jamie Mogul's the president right now. So
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'll put my number in the chat.
Thank you. All right, well, I want to, on behalf of our administrative team, I want to thank the board for having this meeting. And I don't know if Dr. Ritke or Ms. Garrison want to wrap up.
I think that's all for comments. So I think the comments were helpful. This was a good discussion. I love the idea of putting our legislative priorities up on the making practices public forum to keep people updated on where we are and give them some guidance on how they can be most effective. And look forward to the next meeting.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Good night,
It was a pleasure
everyone.
to see everybody.